Hello, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. My name is Susan Oxtoby, and I'm the Senior Film Curator here at BAMPFA. Welcome, of course, to our Chinese Cinema Classics Screen Idols and Stardom Reexamined series. This is a series of 5 feature films, and it will be continue through October 14th. And of course, this event at BAMPFA is a wonderful example here at UC Berkeley of the integrated activities between several units, departments, and centers, where the university has a very wonderful strength in the area of Chinese film studies. UC Berkeley's Starr East Asian Library is now the home of the Paul Kendel Fonoroff Collection for Chinese Film Studies, which is the largest and most comprehensive Chinese film collection in North America. This incredible resource was acquired in 2015 by the library, and it really represents a collection that was amassed over many years by film historian Paul Fonoroff, who is our guest of honor this evening. It is, there will be some discussion about this, so I don't want to go too deeply into the range of the collection, but I do want to say that Paul Fonoroff is our guest this evening. He's traveled in from Bangkok, where he resides, and he will be joined in an on-stage conversation with Zhou of the director of the East Asian Library and assistant librarian here at UC Berkeley. This will be a wonderful chance for us to understand Paul's passion for collecting. I think they'll speak for about 20 minutes. We'll open it up, the conversation up for a few questions, and then we will present The Goddess, the 1934 film made in mainland China. And of course, we're also welcoming this evening Judith Rosenberg, who is the principal pianist here at BAMPFA for all of our silent films. We regularly show silent films from around the world, and it's always a treat to welcome Judith Rosenberg on piano. I hope you will allow me to make a few acknowledgments and thank yous for this very important retrospective of Chinese film classics. First off, we thank the National Endowment for the Arts for their support of this series, and we also wish to thank our film series sponsor, Bonhams, and a particular heartfelt thanks to Jessica Dar, who is the Vice President and U.S. Head of Asian Art at Bonhams, for her generous support of this series. We also thank our colleagues at the China Film Archive in Beijing for lending all of the digital restorations that we will present in this series. We thank Professors Andrew F. Jones and Weihong Bao from the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at UC Berkeley for their expertise in the area of Chinese cinema and for all the great work they do in helping us prepare such film retrospectives. We thank the staff of the Starr East Asian Library, the Center for Chinese Studies, and the College of Letters and Science here at UC Berkeley. As well, this series coincides with the San Francisco Bay Area's Asia Week, our promotional partner on this project. And furthermore, this series is timed with a new book by Paul Fonoroff. I have a display copy here, but you really have to hold it in your hands to see its true beauty. This book is hot off the press. Chinese Cinema Magazines from Charlie Chaplin to Chairman Mao, 1921 to 1951, published by UC Press, beautifully illustrated with 590 illustrations, all drawn from the Fonoroff collection. So our thanks to Nadine Little and the staff who was the editor on the project, as well as the staff of UC Press for making this book a reality. Copies of the book are on sale at the BAMPFA store, and our store is staying open late tonight till 9:15. So if you'd like to buy a copy, Paul Fonoroff is willing to be at a book signing table in the atrium just outside the theater. And as you pass out at the end of the presentation, take a moment to look at the beautiful vintage movie magazines that are on display in a vitrine case. And our thanks to the East Asian Library for loaning those rare copies from the Fonoroff collection. So now that's the end of my thank yous, and I really want you to help me welcome Paul Fonoroff and Peter Zhou to the stage for their conversation.
Testing. Hello?
Oui.
Hello?
Hello?
Well, that's it. Okay.
Okay, so we get started.
Okay.
Okay. The East Asian Library has the distinct honor of being the new home of your wonderful collection. So the first question I have is, if you can tell us how your interest in Chinese film began and why and how you began building the collection.
Okay. Well, originally I wasn't that interested in Chinese movies, not particularly. I mean, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and we didn't really grow up with too much Asian culture. But in 1979, I was studying for my MFA degree at USC in film. And in 1979, after the United States reestablished diplomatic relations with Beijing, they started having a fellowship that Americans could apply to go and study in China. And in 1980, when I got my master's degree, my father was a professor at Case Western Reserve, and he sent me a notice about this fellowship, kind of as a joke. You know, if you can't get a job in Hollywood, why don't you go to China? And but I really wanted to go to China because I had studied Chinese at that point for 9 years already, and I'd gone to school in Singapore earlier, and I didn't want to go as a tourist. I wanted to go for an extended period of time. And so I applied for this fellowship. They were looking for people who already had master's degrees, but you didn't have to be going for a PhD, which I wasn't. And they didn't want people to go there to study Chinese. You had to pass a Chinese exam. But you had to come up with a research topic. So I was thinking, well, you know, I like movies and I like Chinese. Okay, Chinese movies. That's basically how it started. So originally I applied to go to the Beijing Film Academy, but at that time they didn't accept foreign students. So I was placed at Peking University in the Chinese department. As a grad student, I didn't have to go to any courses, which was good because there was nothing there I really wanted to study. And I had a teacher who I met with every 2 weeks, a very wonderful teacher, Ye Daiyun, and we would... she was my advisor, but she didn't know anything about movies, and she didn't particularly care about movies, but we had really interesting discussions. And so I was originally planning to stay for 1 year, but it basically took 1 year to work out enough connections to start doing my research. And when I would go to the film archive, well, I very rarely went to the film archive. It really wasn't that open at that time. But when I went, I was allowed to go to the the Beijing Film Academy, and they had a small library, but they told me I couldn't look at any magazines from before 1949, that it was too sensitive. And so I resolved that, okay, I'll build up my own collection and then nobody can restrict me from looking at things. But at that time, these movie magazines really were not available. I never saw anything that was that old. I mean, I was a collector from way back. I used to collect old postcards of Cleveland. I was interested in Hollywood movies, so I would collect the sheet music, you know, with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and, you know, all of those kind of things. But I didn't see any really old Chinese movie magazines until, I would say, the mid-1980s. So this was at a time after the Cultural Revolution. Films that had once been considered reactionary or taboo, nobody really cared about this anymore in the 1980s. And so some of these magazines were resurfacing in old bookstores and in flea markets and things like that. So in 1986, Chen Xihe, who's now like head of the Shanghai Film Academy, well, just to add, in my last 2 months in Beijing, I was there for 1 year, I renewed for another year, and then I got permission to go see films at the archive. So I had to renew for another 2 months. And I was allowed to see films with the first group of Chinese grad students in cinema. And among that group are people who have become prominent in their fields, you know. And so a few years later, one of those students took me to a bookstore in Shanghai. And they used to have bookstores where they would sell out-of-date magazines. And this was in Fuzhou Lu in Shanghai. So we went up to the second floor, and every surface was covered with movie magazines from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I just bought everything. And as I've said too many times probably, the two rules of collecting are you have to be totally passionate about it, and hopefully nobody else has any interest in it whatsoever. And so I just happened to be there at the right time because the prices were really cheap. There was like this one magazine called Ling Long. It's a women's magazine. It's a small pocket-sized magazine. And they had 161 issues for 161 renminbi, which is, like, well, back then the exchange rate was different, but let's say, okay, a quarter each, let's say, for these 1930s magazines. I almost didn't buy them because back then there were so many magazines that I could buy, I became blasé about it. And so I thought, this is a woman's magazine. It only has a little bit about movies. And so as I was leaving the bookstore, I thought, okay, I'm going to kill myself later when I think I had a chance to buy 161 issues of a 1930s magazine for 161 renminbi, and I didn't. And so I got it. It's all at Berkeley now. But it turns out Columbia has a collection that they've digitized and put online, and they're very proud of it. They have more issues than we do, but we have issues they don't have, and in better condition. So, and anyway, from then, actually the first time I found old magazines, I was working on a film called Taipan. I was an assistant director. This is that movie with Brian Brown and Joan Chan. And we were shooting on location in Hong Kong and Macau and in China, in Guangzhou. And I happened to come across an old bookstore in Macau. And I would always go into bookstores and ask if they had old movie magazines. And this man said yes. And then he asked me a question that nobody had ever asked before. What period are you looking for? And I said, 50s and 60s, because I had never seen a magazine from before the 1950s. And so I said, 50s and 60s. He said, oh, yes, we have them. And then I said, 30s and 40s. And he said, oh, yes, we have them. And from the back, he brought out a small stack. And in that stack of magazines were two that I later discovered were the first two Hong Kong movie magazines from 1926 and 1927. And there was another magazine from 1938, and the cover girl was Lan Ping, and I knew that Lan Ping was Jiang Qing, the future wife of Chairman Mao. So I thought, wow, I just really hit the jackpot. And every time we would have a break in shooting, I would go back to the bookstore and look. And one time I was looking through his garbage, and he said, oh, there's nothing there. And I found 3 old posters. And so he said, oh, Nekam Lek Chai. And he said, oh, you're so clever. So he sold them to me for 3 Hong Kong dollars each, which is, like 40 cents or something. And they're really one of a kind. You won't find them even in the Hong Kong Film Archive. So from there, I just started collecting. And then since I lived in Hong Kong, I had friends in Shanghai and Beijing look for me. And this is in the late 80s and early 90s. And one of these friends, he wrote me back with a long list of magazines that he had found and the prices. And I said, yes, I'd like them. And he wrote me back, oh, they've already been sold. So I told him, in the future, if you find anything like this at this kind of price, don't ask me, just get it. And because of that, I was able to get lots and lots of things.
It's very good, very good. Paul, I checked my calendar today. I remember the first time we met was April 29th, 2015. Okay. So you picked me up in the hotel, and we walked to your apartment. I was immediately shocked, amazed, and happily, astonished by this wonderful collection you have. We talked for hours, and it got pretty late. Mm-hmm. And I asked you, Paul, what do you want to eat? And you told me, I eat cereals. I didn't tell you, but I was so, moved by the simple life you live. So
yeah, I usually had oatmeal for
dinner. Right. I said, Paul, I want to bribe you. So you just tell me where you want me to take you to eat. You said that Korean barbecue over the corner of the street. So I took you there. And we sort of cemented our agreement on that nice dinner. But I didn't ask you this question. I knew at that time there were other institutions that were after your collection. And I tried my best. But why did you decide to let Berkeley have the collection?
Well, first of all, about the dinner, I realized he was probably on an expense account, but I didn't want to take advantage, so we went to the simple. It was just a hole-in-the-wall place, but the food was very good.
Very nice.
Yeah. Anyway, well, when I realized that when I began to think about ridding myself of the collection, and it really took me a long time for it to seep into my brain for me to allow it to happen. Since Dave Wells, who's somewhere in there, he introduced me first to Columbia. He said, Columbia, they have this Starr Library, and they've just purchased a Japanese collection. And your collection seems very much like that, so why don't you write to them? So I wrote to Columbia, and they wrote back. I mean, it was a friendly letter. They said, they don't have any funds. It was only if I could donate it. Now, I was willing for the collection to go at a huge loss, but I wasn't willing for it to go for free. I feel that people appreciate things more if they have to pay for them than if you just let them have them. And because that was another possibility, that I could break the collection up. One of my friends in Hong Kong said he could help me set up with like Sotheby's and have an auction, or I could go on eBay, which would have taken forever to document everything. But I didn't want to break up the collection. I felt, collection is worthwhile in its entirety. Plus, it's really my life's work. I didn't want it to be broken up. And I met somebody from China, from Xiamen, who was planning to open his own cultural center in Xiamen. And he was from a very, very wealthy family. He wanted to buy the collection. But I thought, the money might be good, but you never know what's going to happen in China. What if, policies change, or it's not convenient to have a foreigner attached to it? I would never be able to be a part of the collection in the future. Or what if his family, I didn't know what they did or how they made their money. What if they end up disappearing? Then what's going to happen to the collection? So, I apologized. I said no. Stanford was interested in the collection. And I figured I didn't really pursue it much because I felt Stanford could probably pay a lot more than what Berkeley was willing to pay. But it might just end up in storage. I felt that Stanford wasn't as strong in film and Chinese. Well, maybe they are in certain aspects, but they didn't have the same strengths in both fields. And especially after talking with you, I realized that, Berkeley really had it all. You have as I just said upstairs, so pardon me if some of you have to listen to this again. You have the Berkeley Museum. So things could be displayed. In the future, maybe there will be a huge exhibit of Cultural Revolution posters. Or there's the Pacific Film Archive, and already Susan has arranged so many wonderful retrospectives that involve the collection. And you have this beautiful, beautiful library. So, Peter visited me twice, not once, but twice. And I was really convinced of the sincerity that, they really want the collection. I also had the feeling at Columbia that they would have been willing to buy things that they didn't have. But I didn't want that. I wanted the collection to be as a whole and not just piecemeal, a little bit here, a little bit there. So this was all really, really important to me.
That's very good. And we know that in the world, actually, there are only a few archives that can have this kind of a collection. The Beijing Film Archive is one, Shanghai Library is one. Then after that, probably your collection in terms of the scope. So we know that pretty well, even though this collection is smaller than the other two. Yeah. But it has coverage of Southeast Asia, film in Chinese, and Hong Kong, Taiwan. So it's very broad.
Not much Taiwan, though.
Not much Taiwan, but Hong Kong. Yeah. There's a lot of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So in your view, what's the most valuable aspect of the collection?
Gosh. It's like asking a parent to choose their... No.
All aspects.
I would say that it has a certain depth to it. that it's not just one thing. I was a film critic, especially in from the late 80s, the 90s, and then up till the early aughts. And I used to host a lot of TV shows. I did about 1,200 television programs. And so as a result, I knew it was possible for me to go to these film companies and request lobby cards and posters, and they would give them to me, for publicity purposes. And I knew that these are the kinds of things that they would end up tossing away, but that in the future would have value. And so I spent a lot of time making the rounds. I would get letters from film companies so I could go to the MTR, which is the subway in Hong Kong. I'd go to their depot where they stored those huge posters that are in the subway station. And there were two people on duty. If the mean person was on duty, he would only give me the posters that were listed in the letter. But if the nice person was on duty, he let me have anything that I wanted. And so we have lots of really big posters and lobby cards. And that's modern things. But I think that's a real strength. I knew somebody at Golden Harvest Studio, and I asked him, is there any way I can get any of your old stuff, like from the 70s, because they were established in the 1970s. He said he can't just go in, but if I made a list. So every month I would give him a list, and as a result, the collection has all of the Bruce Lee lobby cards and posters, and the early Jackie Chan stuff. So all of those things are in the collection. So I think that's a strength. In Bangkok, in Chinatown, my partner and I, we went into Chinatown, we knocked on the door of every old movie theater, and we'd ask them, do you have anything old? And they wouldn't, even though he was speaking in Thai, they didn't know what we were talking about. But finally, we hit the jackpot. We found a theater and it was lucky we went when we went because it's no longer a theater. And so he brought down some lobby cards of Hong Kong movies. Southeast Asia was a huge market for Hong Kong and Chinese films, in the 40s and 50s. And most of the theaters were run by ethnic Chinese. So there was a huge audience for, Chinese films. So in this theater, he brought down these lobby cards from old Hong Kong movies. And every time we went to this theater, he would take us to a different room. But nothing was in order, and it was really hot. One time he took us into his office, and they had bulletin boards that had never been cleared, so there were 10 layers of stuff. And underneath all the layers, we found a big photo of a famous Hong Kong movie star that's autographed to the theater. But in the end, we found more than 2,000 lobby cards of 1950s and 60s Hong Kong films. And a lot of these are not to be found even in the Hong Kong archive. So I think there's just a lot of strengths like that, especially, as you mentioned before, the Southeast Asian thing. In Penang, Hong Kong used to have a huge production of not just Cantonese and Mandarin movies, but movies in the Chaozhou dialect and in the Xiamen dialect. And they were not to be shown in Hong Kong because nobody spoke those dialects, but for Southeast Asia and Taiwan, where people do speak those dialects, because the Xiamen dialect is very similar to Taiwanese. And in Penang, I was able to find hundreds and hundreds of flyers for films from those dialects. So, and I think you can't find them anywhere else. So so there's a lot of strengths.
That's wonderful. So finally, Paul, I will not let you go without asking you make some comments about this evening's film, The Goddess.
Oh.
So Rainier is one of the greatest figures in Chinese cinema. So how does her performance in this movie stand out from her other movies?
Well, actually, I think she's excellent in this, and she's been excellent in every film I saw. So I can't say that this film represents a breakthrough because she was consistently excellent. One thing I find that's interesting about the film, not in general, one thing I tried to do in the book, it always bothers me when I read things written in English about Chinese film, is that you never know if the English title or the English name is the official English name or a translation by the person writing the article. Because back then, some things had official English names, but not often, but sometimes they did. But they've been forgotten, and so now people refer to them either by a translated name or just by the Chinese name. So like the studio, Lianhua, the official English name was United Photoplay Service, or UPS. And I have no objection to calling it Lianhua. Or, for instance, another movie in the series that's coming up, The Spring River Flows East. In the collection, there's a souvenir booklet from when it was released in Jakarta in 1948, and the English title was Tears of the Yangtze. So this film, the Shenyu, the goddess, originally it was called The Divine Woman. And that makes sense because, well, this is 1934. Just 5 or 6 years earlier, there was a Greta Garbo movie called The Divine Woman. So the plots had nothing at all similar. I mean, the Greta Garbo's The Divine Woman was like loosely based on Sarah Bernhardt's story. So, it's about, a woman in the theater. So, and that's not this one, but I just find it interesting that it was called the Divine Woman back then. And the little boy in this film, he's one of the top child actors of that time. His name is Li Kang, but his English name was Henry Lai. And his father was Lai Man-wai, who's the father of Hong Kong cinema, and also one of the bosses of the Lianhua, or United Photoplay Service studio. And his mother was Lin Chu-Tru, whose English name was Florence Lim. She was born in Canada. And so he was their child. And another film that's coming up in the series is Rouge Tears, which is a remake of The Goddess. And Li Kang also plays the son in that film. And years later, he became an assistant director in China. And I think he was stationed at the Pearl River studio in Guangzhou. And he killed himself in 1965. But I think under political pressure and things like that. So, anyway.
So, Paul, I remember during our conversations when we talk about the collection, I told you that Berkeley cannot pay you the full price of the market value of the collection, but I can guarantee that your legacy will be preserved and you will be a member of the Berkeley academic community if we have your collection. So today's event is proof that I did not lie to you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
And while I know I said we would take questions, I think what we will do is proceed directly into the film. And then immediately following the film, you should join us in the atrium just outside the theater where Paul will be available for book signing or for just conversation. And now we thank you both, Paul and Peter, and we welcome Judith Rosenberg on piano.